All right, everyone, welcome to room 2, the cool room here at Intelligent Speech. The final talk of the afternoon for this room. My name is David Montgomery. I host the Siekla podcast, but you are not here to hear from me. You are here to hear from Sarah Tanksalvala of the Rejects Revolutionaries podcast. We are here to time travel because today is November 4th, and we are going to hear about November 5th. So, take it away.
Well, hello, and thank you for coming to my presentation as I get this sharing going. Yeah, this is going to be a little bit of a rough one, but it's a fascinating subject, so I think it'll be fine. Okay, yes, my name is Sarah Tanksalvala, and I am the host of Rejects Revolutionaries, a podcast theoretically going through American history in chronological order, but realistically supporting exploring 17th century American history with a strong emphasis on the external conflict that helped to drive events. And one of the most important events that helped to shape that external conflict was the Gunpowder Plot. I've always wanted to do this episode, but I've never gotten around to it. And yeah, with November the 4th being the date of Intelligent Speech this year, it just seems to be the perfect time. So let's start with an overview of the Gunpowder Plot. In 1605, a group of English Catholics planned to detonate 36 barrels of gunpowder containing anywhere between 2 and 10,000 pounds of gunpowder in the cellars beneath the Palace of Westminster. They would detonate them on November the 5th because that was the opening day of Parliament, and therefore not only would members of the House of Lords and House of Commons be there, but so would the king, his wife, and his oldest son. Then they would kidnap the king's daughter and younger son, the future Charles I, to raise them as future Catholic loyalty. They expected uprisings among Catholics to follow the destruction of England's capital, along with the backing of Spain to secure a victory. Simply put, they would blow up England's government and restart from scratch. But the night before Parliament opened, agents of the king found Fox sitting with the barrels and carrying matches. So they arrested him. Fox was tortured, tried, and executed, and his co-conspirators either faced the same fate or they died in a shootout with the king's agents. Famously, though the conspirators were all sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered, Fox avoided the latter two parts of that fate by jumping prematurely to his own death during the hanging portion and snapping his own neck. There were several stories of Guy Fawkes actually after his arrest, and each one portrayed him with a certain level of respect and intrigue, which was kind of interesting. He was said to have endured the rack for days without betraying his companions, simply saying that he had planned to blow the beggarly Scots back to their native mountains. His endurance of the rack without revealing the information demanded was considered a near impossible feat, and that led the king himself to remark with admiration on Fox's Roman resolution and to ask to interrogate him personally. After everything sort of happened, the king called for a day of celebration for the plot being thwarted, and Guy Fawkes Day became Britain's biggest national holiday. Then 400 years later, Fox was rebranded into an anarchist freedom fighter, and a mask of his face became the visual mark of an activist hacker group drawn to that ideology. So it is a very striking story, and it makes some sense that it's grown so famous and infamous. But how it came to occur is a different matter. To start to understand this, we need to take a quick look into each of the plotters, or at least the key plotters as individuals. Though Fox was the man whose name became almost synonymous with the event, he was not the ringleader. And in fact, he was kind of an outlier in the group. He was definitely one of its ringleaders, but he wasn't as connected as most of the other members. He was more middle class than the others. And in fact, he's a person that we don't tend to know too much about. We know that he was born and grew up in York, and his stepfather was key in his conversion to Catholicism. And as an adult, he became one of the many English Catholics, which was over 3,000, to take refuge in continental Europe. He acted as a soldier in the Netherlands for the Spanish using the pseudonym John Johnson. But the real ringleaders of the plot were Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy. Fox, John Wright, and Thomas Winter rounded out the group of 5 at the plot's core, and they were joined by an additional 8 people, including Everard Digby and Francis Tresham. Almost all of the plotters were related either by blood or by marriage. They knew each other well, and even Fox, who was not related to any of the others, had been classmates with the Wright brothers at a school in York. Almost all of them were about 35 years old, give or take a couple of years, with the only exception being Thomas Percy, who was 45. These were all of these people. Well, most of these people were members of the gentry, which made them relatively upper class families with connections to the aristocracy, though they themselves were nowhere near being aristocrats. They were all members of the first generation of English Catholics to be wholly excluded from public life from a young age. And so you can start to see how they started to have the desperation required to do this. Like I said, Robert Catesby was the ringleader of the plot, along with Thomas Percy. Catesby's family had been prominent in England since the time of the Plantagenets, but his father had been a recusant, a Catholic who had refused to attend Church of England services, and he had been fined, imprisoned, and excluded from office as a result, severely diminishing his family's wealth. Catesby's own recusancy had continued the downward trend in the family's fortunes. Thomas Percy was the cousin of the Earl of Northumberland, making him a member of a family with a serious background in royal intrigues. His family had been prominent in England since the time of William the Conqueror, and they had remained the most powerful family in northern England at that time. However, a lot of Percys had been executed over the centuries for fomenting rebellion of one sort or another. If you've ever seen Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1, Hotspur was a son of the first Earl of Northumberland, who was a Percy. And if you've never seen it, Hotspur dies leading a rebellion against the king. And the reason that his father was the first Earl of Northumberland in the first place was because his father had supported Henry IV's successful rebellion against Richard II. The Percys had been heavily involved in the Wars of the Roses, and then they had been involved in, I think, every single rebellion of the Tudor age, specifically the ones against Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. So Thomas Percy was not a particularly high-ranking member of his family. He was a second cousin once removed to the contemporary Earl, but he was one of the Earl's closest confidants and the person in charge of managing his Northumberland estates. Thomas was also the person that Northumberland sent to correspond with the future King James I when negotiating for future religious toleration in England. Percy had a history of violence and dishonesty, including the fact that he was a murderer. He had abandoned his first wife. He had mishandled Northumberland's own money, and he had a habit of stretching the truth. But that nature had been somewhat muted after his conversion to Catholicism, just not completely. Percy was clever. He had a serious temper, and in the first meeting with the other conspirators, he spoke the first words, which were, "Shall we always, gentlemen, talk and never do anything?" And speaking of the Percys, we actually should make note of the 9th Earl of Northumberland, because his role in the plot is simultaneously a little bit vague and basically undeniable. Both Northumberland's father and grandfather had been executed for helping to lead rebellions against Elizabeth I and Henry VIII, respectively, as well as several of his uncles and cousins, and I think even a brother. The 9th Earl, though, played it a little safer, and he didn't allow his affiliations to be too well known. He attended Church of England services, and he played an active role both at court and in helping to welcome the new King James to England. He advocated for Catholics, but he always explained that advocacy by saying that several members of his family and household, such as his servants, were Catholic, and he was simply looking after them. He focused his public efforts on intellectual pursuits, and he genuinely pursued them with such zeal that he became known as the Wizard Earl. And whenever the subject of his own ideology came up, he just remained non-committal. Yet, Thomas Percy was his right-hand man of choice. His money helped to fund the plot, and he was the person who would have raised the king's youngest children if the plot had succeeded. So I'm not going to go through every plotter individually, but I will call out a couple of things. The first is Francis Tresham, who had joined Catesby in a previous rebellion, which I'll discuss later, and whose father had helped to pay for both of their fines for recusancy. And second is Everard Digby, who's not often discussed, but who's a really interesting character. His father had been one of, if not the first professional swimmer in England, and he had published the first English book on swimming. He was noted for his flamboyance and eccentricity, even owning a beaver hat a century before they became fashionable. Something that we know because that hat happened to be stolen later on. Everard himself had spent time at Elizabeth's court, and he wasn't as enthusiastic about the plot as some of the others. When he first learned about it, he asked what was going to happen to their Catholic friends, and he asked whether Catesby had gotten the approval of the nearby priests, to which Catesby sort of fudged the truth to both answers. So Digby was reluctant but convinced, and he was generally and clearly of a gentler sort of disposition than some of the other plotters. But nonetheless, he participated. He gave a huge amount of money to the plot, and he offered over £1,500, which was just exorbitant by the standards of the day. After the plot was thwarted, he became the only plotter to surrender to the king's men, though, and he was the only one to plead guilty at his trial. He explained the reasons for his actions, and he didn't back down from where he felt they were justified. And his final words in the courtroom were, "If I may but hear any of your lordships say that you forgive me, I shall go more cheerfully to the gallows." And a reply came back from the audience, or a member of the audience, saying, "God forgive you, and we do too." And the reason I bring up Digby is not so much because he was a particularly important member of the plot, but because he was a little bit different, and his participation highlights something about the desperation behind it. Thomas Percy, from what I've told you, you can see how he would go that direction, and Robert Catesby, similar. But Digby was a more moderate sort of person, and he came from a more moderate sort of family. That he went to his grave fully assured that some aspects of the plot were morally right, if illegal, and therefore deserving of a traitor's death, highlights something. And to understand the desperation involved, we need to look at the historical context of the plot. Hundreds of years later, it's easy to overlook just how recent some of the key Reformation events and changes had been as of 1605. And it's downright difficult to piece together the many sorts of relevance that each of these events had had. Given the fact that most of these plotters were about 35 years old, we can piece together some of the big events which they had lived through, in addition to the personal histories that we know. For instance, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries had ended just 64 years prior. The modern day equivalent would be something that happened in 1959. So yes, it was getting to be a little bit of an older event, but it was still easily recent enough to inspire strong feelings, especially given what a deeply traumatic and impactful event it was. The Reformation was contentious everywhere, as you probably know, but in England, it was somewhat unique in its cynicism. Everyone knows the story of Henry VIII splitting from the Roman Catholic Church so that he could divorce his wife and marry someone who might be able to give him a son. But in reality, that's only a fraction of what happened. Following this was an event known as the dissolution of the monasteries, during which Henry closed and looted 800 of England's 850 religious houses. He sold anything of worth, including the bricks to local residents to use in other buildings, and he used the money to fund a war with France. He melted the lead roofs into bullets for said war. He destroyed a lot of the books, relics, and artworks, and he sold the land to his supporters. That's the short version anyway. Anyone who tried to stop him was executed, and this was an almost unknowably large number of people, with 10,000 being one of the lower estimates. So now you can imagine the horror that many people likely felt seeing this happen, like at the time. But I want to also draw specific attention to a couple of other things. First, this event left the vast majority of the English population without any real religious leadership. And this was a void that would continue for almost a century. Second is something that's often not talked about, and that is the specific impact of the king giving land to his supporters, because the people that he sold this land to, and he sold it at a relatively cheap rate, were friends of his and supporters of his, but they came from largely non-aristocratic backgrounds. They had a lot of money, but they were not nobles or even gentlemen in many of the cases. And this created the foundation for a power struggle within England that would feature within every subsequent conflict for centuries. To give you an example of one of the people who Henry VIII sold land to and therefore made very rich was a man named Richard Rich, who was one of his advisors. And Richard Rich went from being wealthy to one of the wealthiest men in England due to the land that he obtained from the monasteries. And years later, his grandson emerged as a Puritan agitator at about the time of the Gunpowder Plot. He helped to found a lot of the American colonies. He introduced slavery to Virginia and Bermuda. And then his grandson became one of the leading people in the English Civil War, one of the leading people who caused it by supporting the parliamentary side, or on the parliamentary side. And there were just a lot of other stories like this. This is an example that comes up a lot in my podcast, so he's sort of top of mind for me. So in 1605, this group of people had most of England's money, but they didn't have any titles. They didn't have any aristocratic background, and they had a very vested interest in the Reformation's validity. Their monetary wealth was rooted in that validity, and if they were to give their lands back, they would lose an obscene amount. This contrasted with the likes of Robert Catesby, whose family history was old and illustrious, but who was gradually being reduced to poverty and debt thanks to his faith. So these are deep, practical, ideological, monetary, and class-based divides that would rear their heads repeatedly over the course of centuries, but which were very much entrenched as of 1605. To put things into further context, around this time, England had 3 to 4 million people, but only 100 of those people were peers, and 150,000 were a member of the gentry class, which the Gunpowder Plotters came from. So these divides and these factional divides also involved a small enough number of people that things could be far more personal. And to go back to our timeline, England as a whole didn't and to go back to our timeline, England as a whole didn't convert with Henry's Reformation. In fact, even during the reign of Mary I and at the beginning of Elizabeth I's reign, most English people considered themselves Catholics. Elizabeth also had a vested interest in Protestantism, though, because she was the result of the very union which Henry had split from the church to legitimize. The Catholic Church neither recognized her father's marriage to her mother nor her as a legitimate heir to Henry's throne. This meant that if she became Catholic, she would basically had to admit that she had no right to be queen. And on a less practical level, her mother's family had actually been supporters of the Protestant Reformation. English opinions didn't change when Elizabeth got power, though. They only started to change after the publication of Fox's Book of Martyrs in 1563. So this means that the average Englishman, just 40 years before the Gunpowder Plot, just 5 years before the plotters were born, was still a Catholic. Yet, when the plotters grew up, they had the choice between converting to Protestantism or losing everything. When Elizabeth came to the throne, she was faced with an already tenuous situation. There were too many people with too much at stake, and anything she did would result in threats to her personally. Like I said before, she had a vested interest in England being Protestant because she wasn't considered legitimate by anti-divorce Catholics. The richest people in England had gotten their money from the dissolution of the monasteries, so she had to rule as a Protestant monarch just for practical reasons, despite the fact that the general opinion in England as a whole trended against that. Complicating matters further was the fact that Mary I had also exiled a fair number of Protestants, and others had simply left under her reign. And Elizabeth needed to bring those people back to appease the Protestants that remained in England. However, these people had been living in Switzerland and the Low Countries during this period when they were not in England, and they came back with strong and serious Puritan ideas, effectively radicalized. So Elizabeth was really between a rock and a hard place herself. She had lots of Catholic subjects, lots of potential continental Catholic threats, but she had to be a Protestant, and the Protestant supporters available to her were in no mood for tolerance or moderation. So she took the most pragmatic position possible, which was to tamp down on Catholics as hard as she had to, and to evade every issue that she could. But the oppression of Catholics increased severely during her reign and over the course of her reign. she imposed fines which were carefully calculated to be just over the average salary for a yeoman farmer, meaning your average non-gentleman farmer who did own his own land. And this was enough. This made it impossible for yeomans to keep their land while remaining Catholic. And it was enough to devastate the estates of upper class Catholics as well. And Catholics also couldn't hold public office, they couldn't have certain professions, and they couldn't even visit London for a fair amount of time. Meanwhile, 3,000 Catholics were exiled now, a lot more left voluntarily, and a lot of Catholics were put in the position of having to send their children to live as far away from them as possible, as young as possible, in some cases at like 14 to 16 years old, because they couldn't afford the fines for an entire household. And so they had to sort of send their kids off to live and sort of make do on their own. And meanwhile, Elizabeth was still evading discussion of every issue possible, including who would take the throne on her death. And this environment is the one in which the Gunpowder Plotters grew up. The last 5 years of Elizabeth's reign were intensely uncertain in England. No one knew what was going to happen next, or even what the long-term significance of the current events that were happening at the time was. For Catholics, Elizabeth's reign could either mark a low point that would be healed from, or it could be the beginning of a new status quo, and there wasn't much way to tell which direction that was going to go. And meanwhile, you have the sort of non-purely religious-based factions that I mentioned from earlier before that were now both angling for control. So on the one hand, you had the old nobility who, even if they were Protestant, now tended to be more conservative, and they and this was also the group that included the vast majority of surviving Catholics. And on the other hand, you had the newly wealthy groups. And as the Queen's reign approached an inevitable end, these sides started to angle for long-term power. At their respective heads were Robert Devereux, who Elizabeth had created Earl of Essex. He was her court favorite. He was this charming young gentleman with an aristocratic lineage dating back to the Norman conquest. And on the other hand, you had Robert Cecil, her closest advisor, the son of her previously closest advisor, William Cecil. And this was a family that had only come to prominence with the Reformation, attached to the Protestant Seymour family who dominated England under the reign of Edward VI. And the accession of a new monarch would determine which faction dominated. But Elizabeth wouldn't say who that was going to be, literally until her deathbed, at the point where she was too weak to even speak James's name. And this stressed the entire country.
You got 10 minutes left, by the way, Sarah.
Okay, I'm almost done. This stressed the entire country out. It culminated with the Essex Rebellion, and the problem was that that rebellion was so disastrous, and Essex proved such an incapable leader that no one even takes it seriously today. And he had courted Catholic support for his plot, though, and so ultimately those Catholics who had supported him went on to do the Gunpowder Plot, and the rest is history. All right, I can open it up for questions now.
All right. Lynn Marie asks, I think you talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could expound on it a little. What do you think of the theory that Robert Cecil was partly behind the Gunpowder Plot, or at least that he was a double agent and ensured that he took the credit for its discovery?
That is part of what I just cut out to skip to the end here. I think that it's certainly a feasible it's certainly a feasible explanation. I do think that the plotters probably did act in earnest, though. But yeah, I mean, I think that Cecil may easily have at least milked it and allowed it to go to the very end to have the dramatic ending, which gave him all that power and custody of Northumberland's oldest son, who then ended up marrying his daughter, and that was just crazy. Yeah.
Robert asks, why is the holiday named after the failed plotter? If it was to celebrate successfully foiling the plot, it seems like having a holiday named after Benedict Arnold.
Yes, but like, I mean, what else are you going to call it, really? I mean, the whole ceremony of the day is burning an effigy of Guy Fawkes. So,
does anyone else have any questions? Drop them in the chat, and I will ask them if I'm able to successfully multitask with this boy who has been locked away from me for most of the day.
Oh, if not, I will go and I will say, like, just to go back to something that was kind of interesting that I didn't get a chance to talk about, which is that the children of the Gunpowder Plotters, Robert Catesby's granddaughter became a mistress of Charles II.
Sure, who didn't?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Digby's son became a founding member of the Royal Society, which is the scientific institution in Britain, like the leading one. And so they actually sort of had reasonable lives after all of that happened. The weird exception is the Earl of Northumberland's son, who, well, he had an okay life, but he was raised by Cecil himself, and he grew up and he married Cecil's daughter. And Northumberland, who was in prison at this point, was just furious, and he famously sort of said that he refused permission for the marriage, and he said, you know, our blood wouldn't mix if you poured it in a dish, which I love. But and then that son, actually, who was married to Cecil's daughter, ended up being one of the leaders of the parliamentary side in the English Civil War, and he became this massive Puritan. And the blood didn't actually mix because they didn't have a level heir after that.
How did memory of the Gunpowder Plot shift as various flavors of Protestantism and Catholicism came in and out of favor during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms?
The Gunpowder Plot was really very like, even by James, it became a tangible way for English Catholics to show their loyalty to the English crown. And so they actually supported, like, there was not much overt support for their actions, and it was actually, in a way, it caused their oppression to increase, but in a way it gave them what they had never had under Elizabeth, which was a tangible way to say, no, look, I'm very much for the king and the pope, just not the king as the pope's replacement. And so distancing themselves from the Gunpowder Plot was a very beneficial thing in some ways for English Catholics.
So this continued to be celebrated throughout the reign of Charles I's reign. Charles,
Yeah.
It's not merely a post 1688 phenomenon.
I mean, I don't think so, because it was celebrated in colonial America as well. In fact, one Massachusetts town accidentally burned itself down in the 1630s celebrating it. But no, I mean, that is true. That is true. And so, like, it actually remained it was prominent in America up until George Washington. So
yeah, a question from Robert Jan.
Yeah, hi. It's been argued, and I wanted to ask you what you thought about this interpretation of the plotter's intention. Is that what they were actually trying to do was to kind of provoke an over response, so that the people, the Catholics of Britain, of England, would kind of resist their increasing oppression, and would somehow, it would galvanize them, rather in the way that it's been argued that 9/11 was intended to kind of provoke an attack by the Crusader states on the Islamic world. I was wondering what you thought about that interpretation.
I think that's a little far-fetched, because in losing, the Gunpowder Plotters were almost inevitably going to lose, like, the chance for a Catholic England, period. And if the
No, the
Catholics
argument
weren't
was
going
that
to,
but by succeeding
by
in
succeeding,
their plot,
by succeeding,
they
yeah,
were going
like,
to basically
definitely.
provoke a civil war.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what they hoped for. They did. They
Yeah,
wanted
that's what I mean.
Catholics all over the place to revolt, overthrow their Protestant oppressors, have Spain come in and seal the victory for them, and that would be like, yeah, and they would have a Catholic
And
England.
do you know if the Spanish had any preparations for a response to the plot? Did they know what was going to happen?
That is the point of some debate.
Okay.
Like, I think that the Spanish would have been reluctant to actually support it if it had happened, but maybe it would have been too good a chance to pass up. But they were not in the strongest position at
But
that
they weren't
point in
involved.
time.
They weren't prepared for it then.
Yes, I don't think they were. I really don't think they were.
Well, thank you for your presentation. It's been excellent.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks.
Eric asks, when did the rhyme come into common use?
That's not something I'm 100% sure of, but I actually do think it was during the reign of King James. I'm not sure, though. That is something I'm not sure of. And I do want to address Lynn Marie's quick question, which is about the role of women in the plot. And while I don't think that women were particularly involved in the plot itself, women were sort of the key that held English Catholicism together under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, because they were the people who sort of housed and hid a lot of the priests and things. And it became notoriously and famously, even at the time, something that women were known for.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah, for presenting, and everyone else for attending.
Yes, thank you.
And see everyone at future events.
Yes. Bye.